in God, and that I knew I was going to have a baby and I would get well. I literally had a shift in consciousness that gave me confidence and courage, and I didn't look back. So I am sure my doctor thought I was out of my mind or maybe hallucinating on the morphine that I was on for pain. But this single event changed the course of my life. I was at a crossroad, a fork in the road. Was I going to make a decision based on fear because of a bleak medical prognosis given to me by top human experts that I trusted and respected, or was I going to go down a less traveled? Well, I soon after I got out of the hospital, I continued on the medication and I was already on, and I was madly researching and looking for answers. Anything outside of medicine was completely off my radar. It was just some pill I needed to find. But my condition continued to deteriorate. And in the midst of that, oh my gosh, my husband and I bought a brand new condominium. I can still smell the building materials. And then another bizarre thing, on a routine checkup with my gynecologist, who had actually been on the team of 11 doctors when I had surgery, he discovered I was pregnant. And he immediately assumed I would choose to terminate. And he warned that I would never be able to carry the baby to full term. But suddenly it hit me again, this flash of, I guess I'll call it enlightenment. I was instantly so committed to doing whatever was needed for my baby that I didn't even think about what he was saying. So to everyone's shock, I said I would not have an abortion. I stopped all prescription medications for my kidney situation. I stopped all of the counter medications for all my allergies. And the biggest deal that I still can't make sense of is that I decided to quit eating sugar. Now, where that came from, I don't know, because I was the hardest die-hard sugar addict I had ever known, and literally had no frame of reference or thought that what I ate had anything to do with the way I felt. I went cold turkey off of all that. And the only thing I can think of is I must have read somewhere that it would be helpful if I didn't eat sugar for my baby. So anyway, my pregnancy was bizarre. I already felt so bad that I just continued to feel so bad. So I didn't feel worse. I just felt just as bad as I always did. But to get ready for our baby, close to my due date, we had our home exterminated because, of course, you don't want bugs around your baby. And then I, sick as ever, but determined as ever, decided to paint his bedroom myself. So I'd paint a little, then I'd be on the floor resting. Then I'd get up and paint a little. Well, I immediately went into labor. And the next day, my son Douglas was born, 3 weeks premature. My fever of unknown origin kicked in, and I had no clue that pesticides in paint could possibly be harmful to people, much less unborn babies. And I wasn't using one of these non-toxic paints either. Of course, I was using a nice oil-based paint. Smelled very strong. So after that fact, I now connect these two actions, using pesticides and painting, as reasons why I went into early labor and my fever kicked in, and why my precious child had so many issues. And remember, I'm bringing him home to a newly painted nursery, by the way. Well, our child Douglas was born, and I was in major love. I had refused to have any medication during delivery. I had taken the Lamaze course, and I wanted to do everything I could to not harm him. I wanted to breastfeed. I didn't want him to have any formula, and I was horrified because the doctors wouldn't let me have him since I had this fever. And then after begging and pleading with my doctors, and maybe I'll say demanding, they waived the restriction, as I always had a fever. My doctors knew it. I always had a fever. It was just a little higher than usual. And my baby would stop crying only when I would hold and breastfeed him. the nurses kept telling me they couldn't get him to stop when he was in the stop crying when he was back at the nursery. And so after 10 days in the hospital, we went home, and we went through a very difficult 18 months. And after about 6 months of screaming and crying, extreme irritability day and night, and less being fed and held, a friend told me about the Feingold diet and children's behavior. Well, I was desperate. So I read the book and threw out all the prohibited foods with artificial sweeteners, colors, flavorings, preservatives, foods containing salicylates, and that's what plants use as a natural pesticide to protect themselves. And overnight, we saw changes. After 3 days, he was content to be put down and would actually play by himself and smile. And he was way behind developmentally, but he had made very rapid strides after this happened, and he began to catch up, and he even surpassed the norm. And he started walking at 9 months, and he was unstoppable. But for some reason, and this is going to be really important for later in the story, but for some reason, he was still unable to sleep. And this misery at night persisted until he was 18 months old. And I refused to just let him cry, as many and everyone advised, because I just sensed something was very wrong. Well, unfortunately, I did not experience any change in my condition with the Feingold diet, and I continued to go downhill. And I got so bad that I had to begin taking medication for my kidneys again, so I had to stop breastfeeding. And unfortunately, after starting formula, Douglas regressed rapidly and needed to be held day and night once again. Well, I was drowning, and I was in serious condition. And yet still I had the hope that I'd be led to just the right prescription bottle, because I'd be reading books while I was nursing him. I just read. But there was no internet then. And so it's hard to even fathom that limitation. But an article from a magazine, the Saturday Evening Post, was brought to my attention by my sister. And it was about a doctor in Boston that was using food as medicine. What? Well, this shows how desperate I was. I immediately called the hospital he was associated with, and to cut this short, I got a prescription for a medicinal diet for my particular condition. I tossed out just about everything in my pantry. I continued my medications, but from the first meal, I was no longer thinking about or craving food all the time. I started to gain strength really fast, and I was being transformed. I just started pouring in only real organic food prepared as a prescription for my condition, and I started eating normal portions because I was satisfied. And within a very short time, I was able to get off all medication, and I've never had the need to take even one prescription medication or over-the-counter medication since. And my kidney issues, fever of unknown origin, severe cramps, endometriosis, pollen allergies, all resolved with just a change in diet. No vitamins, no supplements. And I learned that every food has a pharmacological action and acts specifically on certain organs. So that was fascinating to me. For instance, sugar is especially damaging to the kidneys, and probably the fact that I stopped that sugar cold turkey intuitively as soon as I learned I was pregnant was significant for my kidney function as well. So once I was able to get off my medication, I started breastfeeding again. And oh my gosh, an absolutely miraculous transformation occurred about 3 days later, when what I call my truly real child emerged with the most beautiful, calm disposition, no signs of agitation whatsoever at night, day, no irritability. He was a happy, normal child who slept like a baby through the night. Well, after the dust settled, I was in utter disbelief. I had been totally committed to conventional medicine. I wanted to be a doctor, and I felt like all the answers were in that arena. I had now been pushed out of that box to think differently. And I realized we had been poisoned. I mean, all my life I had been poisoned. And how was it in this civilized country we were actually putting chemicals in our food supply as if they belong there, that poison us and alter our brains and bodies? And how was this fact not front page news? Well, I wanted to shout it from the rooftops. How is it that intelligent people, I mean, who actually have heard of this and do know, will even continue to choose to continue to poison themselves? I mean, what are we doing? What are we thinking? Better yet, why aren't we thinking? I wanted to write a book. I was going to. I said, I'm going to name it, Why Didn't Someone Tell Me? I mean, I had ears to hear that were as big as elephants, and I was on a mad search for help, but this never had come into my radar. And I wanted to find a way to give people the opportunity to at least have this information presented so they could make the choice instead of the continual suffering. So they wouldn't have to say one day what I was saying. Well, why didn't someone tell me this? So at that point, I was very focused on the potential of the liberating effect of eating organic, real food. The idea that harmful chemicals elsewhere could also greatly impact health was as remote to me as when I could only see a medicine bottle as an answer. So I ended up changing my career. I studied food as medicine. I became a medicinal cook, and I was given the amazing opportunity to be in charge of the kitchen in a health resort right on the white beach of Montego Bay, Jamaica. We had been living in Houston, Texas, where the air is polluted, to this clean, invigorating ocean air. Overnight, I noticed an upgrade in my sleeping and my physical stamina, and I considered myself to be really feeling good, but this was a new level. So we were preparing organic food picked fresh from gardens every day. We were getting fresh mountain spring water that cascaded down from a waterfall in the mountains of Jamaica for our water supply every day. Fresh fish when we put it on the menu. And the most spectacular awakening I had, though, while I was in Jamaica, was that intelligence is just not what we think it is. For instance, I'm going to say, if you think you have a child with a learning disability, well, there may be more to that than you might think. And my desire to understand this was to become a new focus because all of a sudden, my son, age 5, was dividing, multiplying, adding, and subtracting spontaneously. I mean, what? I had taught him to read, and he could do simple math like 1 + 1 and that kind of thing, but this came out of nowhere. One day I was standing in the kitchen with my Jamaican staff, and he walks in and he announces to the group, "Hey, Mom, there are 70 toes in here." I said, "Oh, really?" And it didn't sink in. But when he said, "Oh, Mom, now there are 50 toes," well, my ears perked up because I realized there had been 7 people in the kitchen and 2 had walked out. And I said, "What do you mean?" And the kitchen staff were dumbfounded, and they started playing games with him, some running in and out of the kitchen several at a time and asking him, "Now how many toes are in here?" And he'd immediately answer the questions. His mind was operating at a different level. He was not taught how to do this. Also, his coordination and athletic ability also improved. The entire family was enjoying enhanced health and well-being. We were experiencing what I started to call the power of pure outdoor air, plus, yes, pure food, pure water, and all of that was a factor. And just as an aside, before I move on here, there are many studies out now, especially from Harvard, that show how the quality of air affects IQ. So You say that you had your IQ tested at age 5 and it was so and so. Well, that is not a fixed number. It can fluctuate.